From Flourish DX, this is the Psych Health and Safety Podcast. With workplace mental health becoming a safety prerogative, this is the source of information on psychological injury prevention and health promotion.
Hi, and welcome to the Psych Health and Safety Podcast. My name is Jason and I'm one of the hosts of the show. The aim of the podcast is to rapidly increase the knowledge and application of psychological health and safety in workplaces worldwide. To help with this, we have regular guests from around the world who are leading the way in this important area. But before I introduce our guest and topic for today, allow me to introduce my co-host, Joelle Mitchell. How are you today, Joelle?
Well, it's we're certainly in a venue.
It is a venue.
Yeah.
A little bit bigger than the last one we were in.
Sure is. Very bright lights. Yep.
Yeah.
Feeling good.
Feeling good. You ran a masterclass on Tuesday. How'd that go?
It went well. Yep. We had. It's nice to run a session with an audience who isn't trying to think of reasons to disagree with you.
Yeah. So a lot of Joelle's work is convincing people, right, regarding why it's important to do psych health and safety. But
it really is your job, employer. To do some stuff,
But you had more willing participants this time?
Yeah, there wasn't anybody going, no, this is rubbish, this is not my job, I'm not a counsellor, I shouldn't be doing any of this.
Yeah, nice.
Shockingly, none of those comments.
And you presented with one of our other team members, Andrew Toyer.
Yes.
His nickname is Mr. Toyer, I believe. Yeah.
I think you're the only person in the world that calls him that.
There's a lot of nicknames in the office that I'm the only person that calls them that.
Yes.
Yeah. And then yesterday we had two other pre-conference masterclasses, one with the godmother of Psych Health and Safety, Marianne Baton, who's going to be on later this morning, and Rob Briner.
Yep.
How'd they go? Because you and the whole team attended those ones, right?
We did, yes. We were, it's quite nice, again, to be in the audience instead of doing the song and dance sometimes, so that was really nice. To have the opportunity to learn from other people. Yeah, both of them, again, went very well. I'm sure that, there's people here today who were at one or both of them, but it seemed to be very well received. Yeah,
and I hear you and the rest of the team were quite disruptive, particularly during Rob's session.
I mean, Rob was, asking for lots of participation, so we were just...
Heckling?
No, not heckling, no. We were cooperating.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, our guest is patiently waiting, and people aren't here to hear from us. They're here to hear from our guest, right? So, well, maybe they're here to hear from you. I don't know. They're not here to hear from me.
I'm sure they're here for our guests.
So we should probably introduce him in.
Yep.
Okay. So a professor of Organisational Psychology, he is known for his advocacy for evidence-based management and evidence-based HR. His areas of research include work and wellbeing, the psychological contract, work, non-work relationships, and ethnicity. He first appeared on the Psych Health and Safety Podcast in May 2022. A very warm welcome back to the podcast, Professor Rob Briner.
Hello. Good morning. Hi, hello again, hello.
Welcome.
Hello again. Hi.
Welcome, Rob. How are you today?
I'm all right, I'm good. Thank you for the fruit, by the way.
That was unexpected. I mean, I keep saying it would be great if mental health was as easy as giving away fruit baskets.
Yeah. I try not to eat too much during the record because it could be quite disruptive, couldn't it?
Yeah, it probably could. We'll save it for later.
Misophonia,
Yeah, nice. Do that. Well, thanks for coming on and flying all the way across the world.
You're very welcome. Thank you for inviting me. It's a delight to be here. Thank you.
Yeah.
So what have you been up to since we last recorded with you?
Did you say May 2022? Well, May 2022, what's happened since then? Quite a lot of stuff. The ravages of time, that's got a big thing for me that's been happening. Perhaps most significantly, I guess, career-wise or profession-wise, is I've now started to work part-time at my university, but also part-time for a small business called Corporate Research Forum, whose mission is to do research and training for HR functions to help them be more evidence-based and to help the business and be more effective. So I'm kind of, to use that word that I don't really like, I'm a bit more of a kind of pracademic. There's only pracademics here today, but that kind of combination, I guess, of academic stuff and practice, which, given my interest in evidence-based practice, kind of suits me very well, actually. So that's kind of the main change, I think,
Yeah, good. Very cool.
So, Rob, this is the crux of it, right? This is what we want to get into today.
Get to the crux.
Yeah. What does it mean when we say that employers should adopt an evidence-based approach to psychosocial safety?
Yeah. So I think the easiest way I think to think about it now, and I've been sort of, as you know, talking about this for a long time, is to think about 3 principles. So the first is you use multiple sources of evidence. So that might include stakeholders, your expertise, data from the organisation, and external evidence, including scientific evidence. The second principle is you take a structured approach. And what that means is you first think, what is the issue we're dealing with when it comes to psychosocial health and safety? And once that's identified, then what can we do about that if there is indeed a problem or issue you need to address? And then the third thing is you focus on the most trustworthy and relevant evidence. And that's important because we're surrounded, as everybody knows, by lots of data and evidence that's pretty unreliable. You don't want to include that in your kind of decision making. So essentially it's following those 3 principles to answer 2 questions: what's going on and what can we do about it? And although that sounds incredibly simple in a way it is, in practice it's actually quite difficult to do because of lots and lots of barriers and things that get in the way of doing that. But it's this crux, it's just saying what's going on and what can we do about it, trying to use a combination of the best available evidence and critical thinking. So that's it.
Yeah, and I find, I'm not sure about you, but I see there's some confusion. Like there's evidence-based practice, which you obviously lecture on and teach on.
Yeah.
And then there's evidence-based approaches, and I think you're talking about evidence-based approaches there.
Yes.
Is evidence-based practice different to that?
Well, evidence-based practice is, I guess, describes the process, and for me the whole point of evidence-based practice in general, whether it's in this field or HR or psychology or medicine, it's about making kind of better informed decisions. So it's really about the process. The outcome is obviously the thing you're going for, but the most important thing is to go through that process. So I think evidence-based, evidence-informed, all those different terms are kind of describing something similar. The key thing is about the process, not a particular practice. It's about a process.
Yeah. And that evidence-based practice is actually very similar to what employers are now legally required to do, or there's a clarification of the legal obligation under psychosocial regulations to follow practice, because it's no longer just put in a shiny fruit basket or other kind of well-being interventions. It's you actually have to diagnose, you have to put something in, you have to assess whether your intervention's been effective, right?
Yeah, exactly. And I think it's again, it's one of those things that illegally, and the same is true in the UK, it's quite easy to say that and people get the principles, but what they often lack is a process they can follow to do it. And I guess evidence-based practice is quite a generic or general way of thinking about how you can do that, both assess, kind of diagnose what problems might be, and then once identified, think about what kind of intervention might be most effective. But also crucially thinking about potential side effects and downsides of that intervention. So this is something, and is often forgotten, particularly in the context of, I guess, psychosocial health and safety, is that a lot of the interventions, some of them will have benefits, or to some extent they will have negative outcomes potentially, and sometimes not have much effect at all. And that's fine, but the evidence-based practice approach allows you, I think, to think that through a bit more carefully and be responsible as an employer in terms of saying we did kind of due diligence and really try to understand what was the issue and what we did about it, and this is why.
Yeah, terrific.
So one of the areas that you focus on is evidence-based HR.
Yep.
Why is that important when it comes to psychosocial safety?
Yeah, I mean, increasingly I think that the link between, say, health and safety, organisational psychology, HR, and other things within organisations, I think there's an overlap here, quite a big one, and an important one. And I think if each, to use that much overused phrase of silos, if different parts of the organisation are dealing with this thing in their own particular way, it's not particularly useful. And I think that kind of collaboration bit's really important. So if you take a step back and think about what is HR actually about, apart from the operational and transactional stuff, what it's about essentially is shaping human behaviour, because that's what we want to do in HR and management, and also think about people's well-being, of course, as well. But we shape behaviour in ways that we think will lead to behaviours that will drive organisational performance and organisational objectives. So clearly it means, if you think about psychosocial health and safety, it seems to me that to not collaborate with HR doesn't really make much sense, and it misses a trick. And indeed, I think there's a sort of relationship here, both with organisational psychology as well, such that I think for health and safety people, the more they understand about HR and the way the organisation works, the better. And similarly, the more HR people understand about psychosocial risk, the better they can do their work as well. So it seems to me they need to be collaborative and actually learn from each other and work together. So I think there's a massive overlap, which in practice isn't always realised. And sometimes, I'm sure you've seen this as well, you have organisations where there might be occupational health and safety people working on well-being in their own way, and then you go to HR and they're kind of doing their thing, but but it's sort of different and it's not connected at all. So I think that collaboration, understanding is really important.
Yeah, I think, what we see a lot of is HR probably not understanding that a lot of the systems of work that they have ownership of are actually, or could be, controls for psychosocial hazards or for psychosocial safety. So, if we look at our performance management framework or the way that we recruit and onboard people,
yes.
or, how we do performance development, how we deal with grievances, all of these things
yes.
are actually really important controls for psychosocial harm, or psychological harm rather. So a lot of it is around reframing how the business overall is thinking about these HR systems, and potentially, tweaking them a little bit so that they are actually going to do the job of managing potential psych hazards, as well as the other people risks that they were probably originally designed to manage.
Yeah, I think one way of thinking about it is almost everything HR does has the potential to impact how people feel at work. That's partly what it's there for, right? It's to make people feel different things at work. And I think one thing has happened in HR, and again, I don't know if you'd agree with this, but it seems to me that historically, if you look at things like job design, going back to the 1950s, 60s, 70s, that was something then that I think HR was much more involved with, this idea that we're creating an environment that will both contribute to people's well-being and, crucially, help them perform better. That kind of sense of that dual thing somehow has disappeared a little bit off HR's radar, whereas I think, go back several decades, it was very much thinking about how you design jobs, and that sort of disappeared a bit. So to your point, Joelle, I think that sort of connection between we're doing things in HR that will impact people's well-being or act as controls, as you say, is that sort of thinking slightly being lost. I don't know why, it's a bit mysterious to me, but it does seem to have been lost to some extent.
We could probably engage in some conjecture about that, but it might not be helpful.
We could.
It'd probably be entertaining though.
Yeah.
So thinking more practically then, how can HR practitioners distinguish between interventions that are backed by solid evidence and those that are just trending or anecdotal?
Yeah, I think we go back to the fourth person on the stage here, fourth object, the fruit basket. But I think there is a lot of kind of fruit basket type interventions around here and in this field. And I think one of the challenges with well-being in particular at work is, the expression, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. I think there are a lot of good intentions around wellbeing interventions at work. So people are aware that people might be, experience burnout or depression, there might be bullying and bad stuff going on. They're also aware that they could create an environment where people can really flourish and feel good about work. So there's a strong awareness of the need to do something. And in those sorts of contexts, this need to do something often leads to just throwing all kinds of solutions at non-diagnosed problems. How can practitioners distinguish between things that are supportive and not? I think there's a number of ways. Firstly, I think the most important thing to start with, is to think about, is this thing that's being sold to me a fad? And how do you work out if something's a fad? So there's different criteria you can use to think about this, but one is, for example, is it very, very popular at the moment? Is it new? Do people get very excited about it? Do people like it a lot? Those kind of things might indicate a fad, along with stuff like, is it being promoted by gurus or so-called thought leaders, or whatever it is. So they're signals it might be, a problem. And the other thing is, if you ask a question about something that is a fad, if you say, for which problem around well-being is this the solution? If you can't see a match between them, again, it might indicate it's a fad and something that's not particularly supported by evidence. So what is supported by evidence? How do you find out? I think and this is a challenge for lots of practitioners, how do they get at the, if you like, scientific evidence, which might be a good source of evidence to think about this? It's often quite difficult. So I think there is, you can obviously go on Google Scholar and look at other kinds of things, but I think the best thing to do is, once you see a practice, is think about what are the claims being made about this? What does it claim to do? And what might the evidence look like that would tell me it can in fact achieve that? So getting away from just anecdotes and case studies, and they can be important for other reasons, and saying, so what actually is the evidence base behind this? And it's often quite hard to find, but I think you can find it in principle. And also bear in mind that I think there aren't kind of practices that work and practices that don't work. There's a bit of evidence probably for lots of things, so you also need to make that judgment. So it's a hard thing to do, but I think often people relying on their own sense of what's the claim being made, what would really support this in terms of evidence, and can I find it or not? And particularly if you're working with suppliers, ask them. They're coming to you, they're trying to sell you something, do your due diligence. Show me that this works, not just an anecdote, but show me some of the data and evidence behind it.
Do you have any thoughts on those industry papers where they, calculate the ROI of mental health interventions in the workplace?
Yeah, I do. Typically,
share them with us.
Yeah, they typically don't seem to be very thorough or rigorous, it seems to me. So again, when someone shares any piece of information, you've got to think, what is your motivation for telling me this? And might have a reason to tell this story rather than this story. So I think it's possible to calculate it, but it often seems to be quite exaggerated, and it seems to be often just around one or two organisations, which is okay, but it's not enough to make very strong claims about it. So again, in terms of things like ROI, I think we need to think about it in terms of our own organisation, the organisations we're working with, rather than just generic, if we do this, it will create this ROI. It might, but it might not do that in your particular context. So I think it's treat them with a shovel of salt, I think.
Yeah. It is interesting when you see those and they'll do the calculations and they'll put in there maybe a dozen different types of interventions and then go, well, a mixture of those will get you this ROI, but who's going to invest in all that stuff?
Yeah, exactly. And also I think it's made based on the assumption that, for example, more interventions are necessarily better, and it may not be. And also it's the mechanism, even if you introduce wellbeing interventions, it may have this outcome, but is it through your change in well-being? And again, they don't typically look at that. So I guess the theory is we do an intervention, it enhances people's well-being, that increase in well-being leads to performance. That actual connection is rarely made because it's actually quite difficult to do. You can do it, but it's quite difficult.
Yeah, I find, those papers are quoted often by wellbeing practitioners, HR practitioners, even health and safety practitioners. But if you were to share them with an exec, they'd see through a lot of the assumptions in that straight away.
Yes.
It can derail your argument.
Indeed. They're used often, I think, to sell products and to say, please pay attention to me because if you do my thing that I'm arguing for, it will have this clear benefit for you. And I think sometimes we underestimate or I think the fact that, senior leaders in organisations, yes, of course they're interested in the bottom line, but not only interested in that. I don't mean because they're sort of wonderful, warm human beings, though some of them are. It's more because that's not the only thing they're doing in a business. So if you look in any organisational business, if you look at everything everyone's doing, is all of it connected to the bottom line? Absolutely not. People do things for other reasons. Sometimes they're good reasons, sometimes they're not so good. So we have to bear in mind that trying to convince people to do things just because of an ROI, apart from the quality of the data, is not the only argument you can make to persuade people to take something seriously, I think.
All right, so we've used some sources of evidence to identify that there is a problem. We've used some sources of evidence to decide on a solution that we're going to put in place. Next, we should evaluate whether that solution has worked or not.
Indeed.
How? So if you're talking to HR or health and safety people in the audience who should be tasked with doing some sort of an evaluation, what sorts of things should they be doing?
Yeah, okay, so one of the challenges with innovation, and it may apply to people here, is sometimes people can contact me and say, we want to do an evaluation of this thing we did, whatever it is, training, wellbeing, whatever. And so the next question you ask is, well, what was the problem? And typically they haven't got a great understanding what the problem was. And they say, what were you trying to achieve? And typically they don't sort of have a very clear idea of that. And you say, sorry, it's kind of too late to evaluate it because you've already done this thing. You're not exactly sure why you did it. So it's really hard to evaluate. One advantage of that evidence-based practice process is because in the first stage, you say, what is the issue or problem or opportunity? And you try and identify it as precisely as you can given the data you've got. So if it's a well-being issue, you can say, well, we think this aspect of well-being is too low, or this aspect of negative well-being is too high, but you actually pinpoint what you think the problem is. And then when you've got your intervention, you already know what that intervention is designed to achieve. So going through that process, evaluation of an intervention becomes much more straightforward because you don't have to ask those post hoc questions. You already know what you were trying to do. So it becomes much more straightforward to build in the evaluation to not only the design of it, but build the evaluation also based on what you think the issue was in the first place. So it sort of joins the dots together much better, I think, than this kind of post hoc we need to evaluate.
Yeah, so we test, intervene, retest.
Yeah, that is one way of doing it. Yeah.
What would other ways be?
What other ways?
Yeah.
Well, it's funny to talk about, I often think about interventions. It's a kind of funny thing, right? So you could say you should always evaluate intervention. And indeed, in principle, if the world was a perfect place, absolutely. It's often hard to get resources to do that from organisations. They don't feel they've got the time. Often evaluations can take years. They're pretty complicated. If you can't evaluate or don't think you can afford it, rather than do it really badly, I'd say invest it up front in saying what is the problem and what we can do about it. Yes, ideally you evaluate too, but I say doing that still increases your chances of getting an evaluation that's likely to be effective. Now you could say, but you didn't find out if it was. That's true, but you try to maximize the chances that it has tackled an issue you've actually identified, and you've compared different evaluations, and through using evidence and data, you said this evaluation is likely to work best. So it seems like a funny thing for me to say, but you don't necessarily need to evaluate. It's ideal if you can, but if you do those other bits really well, I would say it makes it less necessary to do an evaluation, unless there's a higher risk kind of context. So I think thinking through the process from beginning to end means you don't necessarily always need to evaluate. And sometimes, as I said before, the kind of evaluations I see, a bit kind of panicky evaluations. We did this thing, and we don't know if it works or not. We don't really know what we're trying to do. God, we better measure some stuff. And you think, no, that's kind of too late. As I say, it's like the wrong way around. So perhaps almost not evaluating is okay to some extent as well, I think.
Yeah, I guess that's probably a difference in the HR approach to the health and safety approach, because it is actually legislated that if you put controls in place, you should monitor them to make sure they're effective. So there needs to be some level of evaluation.
Yeah, I mean, I think monitoring evaluation is the same thing. It's kind of similar, I suppose. And I think some of the outcomes we're talking about, like lots of outcomes in relation to well-being, is one of the challenges, because people's well-being at work is shaped by so many other things, including what's going on outside work, their personality, all sorts of other stuff. You may see, in terms of monitoring, shifts in that, either or no shifts. You may see improving, some aspects getting better, some aspects getting worse, some aspects not changing at all, but attributing that to the intervention is, particularly in psychosocial health, it's quite difficult, I think. It's quite difficult to make that connect. Not that you can't, but it's quite difficult to so many other influences on well-being. And that, I think, is just a broader challenge for everyone here working in psychosocial health and safety, that the thing we're trying to deal with and control and help make better is shaped by so many things outside work that it doesn't mean we can't, but it means it's kind of limited. If like 80% of what shapes well-being at work is not to do with work, you've got a limited thing to kind of to play with, to shape it. Again, to me, you can't, but it's important to bear that in mind, I think.
So what we're talking about, I guess, is a good segue into the next question I had for you. And thanks, by the way. I see there's well over 20 questions now on
20 questions.
Yeah,
great.
We're not going to have time for all of those, but we'll probably have probably a good half hour or so for audience Q&A, which is what we wanted. So that'll be great. Make sure you upvote the ones that you want to have asked. But I guess what are the most common barriers internal HR practitioners face, and maybe health and safety or other types of practitioners face, when trying to implement evidence-based practices? Yeah,
so I guess over some time I've noticed that in general most people think evidence-based practice is a good idea, double thumbs up. And then you say, well, are you doing it or can you do it? They go, it's tricky. And there are indeed many, many barriers. I think one is, the incentives, and this applies to HR, to managers, to academics, to many practitioners, health and safety practitioners, is the incentives. Often we're rewarded for doing stuff. And the more stuff we do, well done, the better you are performing, it seems to be. So what it means is taking an evidence-based practice approach means not just doing stuff. It means stopping, thinking, reflecting, collecting data, saying what is the issue and what can we do about it. And if you are incentivized just to do more and more things, you say that is a great approach, but you know what, if I do that, I'm not going to get rewarded for it. So that's one thing. Another barrier, I think, as you mentioned before, is the fact a lot of things that link to that is a lot of things that practitioners do, our work is not actually evaluated. So whether we do a really good job or a terrible job, unless we completely screw up, no one really knows. So it seems okay. So again, people judge it by kind of activity. We already mentioned fads. I think that's a really big barrier to it as well. There's often a lot of politics involved in this. So again, if you're working for a function or a leader or a manager who is not interested in evidence-based practice, it's really hard for you to operate in that way, because they're likely just to say, look, here's these 3 things. Can you do them in the next 6 months? Just get on with it. And if you go, sorry, why am I doing this? What is it for? How is it going to help? Some managers might like that, but many managers just say, look, can you just do it, please? We need to get on with it. Because the problem is they are being rewarded for the stuff they get done, so they want to make sure you get the stuff done. I think there's so many barriers. It's why someone yesterday described why evidence-based practice doesn't get done more as this kind of idea of a wicked problem. There's so many things that get in the way of it. I think another barrier, of course, is, for example, just one source of evidence is scientific evidence. One barrier as well is the way academics and scientists often do scientific research that's not relevant to practice. And even if it might be, it's very hard to get hold of it. It's really hard to understand it. It's kind of interpenetrable, and it's not really focused on practical problems very much. So that's another kind of barrier. I read a review recently, and this was measuring well-being in the workplace. So it was a study looking at different measures, and there are over 240 different measures of well-being at work used in academic literature. If you're a practitioner, that is not very helpful. So again, that's another kind of barrier, but there's kind of there's lots.
Yeah, so we all come from a background in organisational psychology.
Yeah.
Joelle is currently supervising me, so I can actually call myself an organisational psychologist,
okay.
Which should kick in later this year, hopefully, if she passes me.
We'll see.
No conflict of
No
interest.
pressure.
And I remember, it would have been one of my very first classes, we talked about organisational diagnosis. Right?
Yeah.
So you diagnose, you put in intervention, you evaluate.
Yeah.
But diagnosis and evaluation has never been sexy, right? Like people just want to do things like you say, add stuff. They don't want to do the work beforehand. They don't want to do the work afterwards.
It's the bias to action, which is very common and it's really problematic. I think HR and probably health and safety, lots of practitioners, the problem for them is not doing stuff. They're good at doing stuff. Practitioners are really good at doing stuff. Is that stuff relevant and helpful? A whole different kind of question. And sometimes with HR, and I'm sure it happens in health and safety as well, one thing that HR loves to talk about, and other functions, is they love to talk about how they've rolled stuff out. And rolling stuff out is the greatest feeling. Do you like rolling things out? Yeah, it's great, isn't it? Don't you feel good when you've rolled things out? Did anybody want it? Does it matter? Who knows? Who cares? But you bloody well rolled it out, and you can high-five each other. And that's a great example of bias to action, you know. And going back to the diagnosis thing, it's also very interesting the case of, again, I think health and safety is probably a bit better at this than organisational psychology. Many years ago, I went to an event in the UK where there was a very elderly person who, sadly, I can't remember this person's name, but he was comparing organisational psychology with other areas of applied psychology and medicine and other kinds of fields. And he said that one of the problems in organisational psychology, particularly, for example, around well-being at work, is we had not been great on thinking about diagnostic criteria and frameworks for diagnosing. So a really good example is, it's a really common thing in organisations. They may have an issue around, they think they've got an issue around employee performance. As organisational psychologists or other practitioners are supposed to know about this, we don't sort of have exactly the tools to hand to allow us to do that. We could go and dig them out and create a framework for each client, but we don't have those kinds of tools. So you're right, diagnosis is seen as a bit, boring, can we just kind of do stuff? But it's so crucial, but we're often lacking good frameworks for doing that. So I think the more, particularly around psychosocial health and safety, I know it is happening and you're involved in it, but the more we can develop good ways of diagnosing what is going on, it's an absolutely essential starting point. I think it's even more important to think about interventions, because there's lots of things we can think about in terms of interventions, but you need to understand the problem first. So it's really important.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I've had some people who have been working in the workplace mental health field for a while and maybe coming in more at the tertiary end, the responding. And I think they get a little bit confused with the regulations we now have in Australia, and they're like, that's kind of people just box ticking. I'm like, well, if we're diagnosing, so doing a risk assessment, putting in controls and then monitoring to make sure that they worked and evaluating that and continuously improving, isn't that what we should have always been doing?
Exactly.
Like with workplace mental health?
Yes, absolutely. It's sometimes presented as some new, exciting idea, but it's like an ancient idea, really. Yeah. And I think one of the challenges legislatively, including in the UK some time ago, so around 25 years ago, I was involved with the HSE in the UK, their management standards for stress, where they're trying to sort of develop diagnostic tools and criteria and so on. And one of the challenges around that is that some employers actually were slightly, although they were legally required to sort of do some sort of risk assessment, as they are here, There's a slight reluctance to do it because, of course, once you do it, you find a potential, you then have to do something about it. And that whole thing about foreseeability. So if you measure things now that might predict something really serious at some unknown point in the future, you have to kind of do something, and often what that thing is, it takes a bit of work to find out. So there's a kind of reluctance, sort of, let's kind of slightly avoid this, and back to your box ticking thing, let's just tick boxes to show we're compliant, but we're not really, don't want to get into it very much. And that's another real challenge in this field, I think.
Do you need more psych health and safety in your life? Then head over to the FlourishDX Academy for several free on-demand e-learning courses. If you're an internal professional, follow FlourishDX on Eventbrite to register for any of our free fortnightly interactive webinars. Our flagship professional practice program is also exclusively available for internal professionals. The 12-week course blends theory, applied practice, and interaction with other professionals through live lectures and a monthly community of practice session. Find out more about all these learning opportunities or inquire about a bespoke in-house training at the FlourishDX Academy. www.45003.org. Now back to this episode.
What should practitioners do, whether they're HR or safety or whoever it might be, in businesses when they come up against leadership decisions that are not grounded in evidence?
So if we look around the world right now, if you want, it's a bit depressing, I suppose, for this Thursday morning. If you look around the world at, say, our political leadership, you could say, of course, not this country, not Australia, but I'm talking about the other bad countries. You could say that the political leadership is kind of leaves a lot to be desired in terms of, being evidence-based, should we say. But on the one hand, you could say, well, can you blame those individual leaders because they were, after all, people voted for them? And similarly in organizations, the people at the very top of the organization, they think they got there partly because obviously they really wanted to get there, they wanted to be leaders, but the system, the process allowed them to get to that point. And again and again and again, to your question, Joelle, I hear people saying, I want to be evidence-based, or the HR function wants to be evidence-based, but the leader doesn't think in that way. And the reason they don't is often the reason people get to be very senior leaders, apart from the fact they're obviously all total psychopaths. Of course they're not. There's some really nice leaders too, but present company accepted, is because they just have a desire to get to this position, and they didn't get there by being evidence-based themselves. So if someone comes along and suggests it to them, for some leaders, this is like quite a revelation. You use data and evidence, you make an informed decision, you understand the problem, and then, wow, that's a kind of new thing for me. How do you persuade them to do it? I think there's two basic questions. I'm not sure these work always, but I've seen them work a little bit. Is if you say to senior people, ask them two questions, and it's the same for individual practitioners as well. Do you want to do things that will actually help the organization achieve its objectives? And most senior leaders go, yeah, of course I do, yeah, they go, great. And do you want to kind of do stuff that is most likely to help us get to that point? And they go, yeah, great, I do. Yeah, okay, so how are we going to do that? And without using the expression evidence-based practice, you could as well, but I think it's to say, well, to do that most effectively, you need to be really clear about what the objectives are. You need to think about what is most likely to get you to that point, and therefore what we need to do, for example, in HR, health and safety, to help you do that. And I think if you break it down a bit for senior people, I mean, again, it's one of these things, they kind of get it. They might then be concerned about, oh God, won't it take too long? Will we find out things that we don't like? Does it mean I won't be able to follow my pet projects? Yeah, it does, but that's not a bad thing. And it's a question of persuading people. Is it more important for them to do the pet projects, or is it more important for them to help the organisation achieve its objectives? And I'm not saying you would always win that argument, but I think it's a sort of start to get people to think in that kind of direction.
The fad aspect of things, I think, can also be a challenge there, right? But look, everyone else is doing mental health first aid. All of our peer companies are doing it. It's got this great marketing campaign. Surely it's good.
Yes. And this is a problem, not just for leaders, but lots of people in lots of functions, whether it's marketing or finance or HR. They will go to conferences, they'll talk to their mates in other organizations in similar roles, and they'll say, what are you doing? One of the very common questions I get asked by practitioners, whatever I'm happen to be talking about, whether it's performance or talent or motivation, whatever it is, people often say, what are other organizations doing? And I say, why do you want to know? And I'm not saying you shouldn't know, and it is useful up to a point to do that, but the danger is that you say, oh, if everyone's doing it, as you say, we should do it as well. And one of the problems is that it's really hard to identify, just because an organization is engaging in a practice, even if it's a very successful organization, it's very hard to attribute that performance to that actual not fad, or that technique, that intervention. It's really hard to draw the links between them. And I think the best analogy for that is if you think about Silicon Valley tech bro billionaires, you know what I'm talking about, right? So look, watch the answers to this, right? Silicon Valley tech bro billionaires, you know what I'm talking about? What time do they get up in the morning?
Ugh.
What time do they get up? 4, 5. What do they do, a Silicon Valley tech bro billionaire, after they've got up? What do they do next? Are you a Silicon Valley tech bro billionaire? He now says meditate. They meditate or they journal. And what might a Silicon Valley tech bro billionaire eat or drink? Yeah, a green smoothie. That's right. And when a Silicon Valley's done all this kind of stuff and they open their wardrobe, what will be in the wardrobe? The same clothes. Why? Because the Silicon Valley tech bro billionaire, obviously, they don't spend any milliseconds of their amazing genius brains working out should they wear a green t-shirt or a red t-shirt, so they always wear exactly the same things every day. So this is a really good example. You sometimes see this sort of kind of clickbait thing on social media. So here are the habits of Silicon Valley tech bro billionaires, with the basis that if I started getting up at 4 o'clock, if I drank a green smoothie, if I meditated, if I wore the same clothes every day, then I would become a tech Valley's billionaire. Of course I won't, and that's exactly that problem, is if you look at successful companies, they're all doing this thing, but you don't know whether they are successful because they're doing that thing, and equally, even if they are, just because that thing helps them be successful doesn't mean it's going to help you be successful. But it's a really tempting thing. And it's interesting to look at, but you should really, I think, think through, does it mean that's why they're successful and if it's relevant to us?
Yeah, and it is about the context of the business,
absolutely,
right?
Absolutely, yes.
Can I say, Rob, that's probably the best way I've heard it explained.
Oh, thank you very much.
You shouldn't just borrow something that someone else is doing, apply it in your own organisation.
Yeah, and there's lots of this clickbait. You see it in, all over social media, like people who are successful, and there's horrible, have you ever seen the horrible graphics that kind of got pictures of successful people on one side and unsuccessful people on the other? Successful people journal, apparently, unsuccessful people complain. Okay, so it's a similar kind of concept. You say, here's a category, and these are things people do. You do these things, you'll be like them. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Well, I've got one more question before we go into audience Q&A, and there's over 60 questions in there. So
great, good.
We're not going to get through all 60 questions, everyone, so make sure you upvote the ones that you want to.
I can speak very fast.
You'll have to do a speed round, right? Like 10 seconds per question. No, last question for you. What are some practical steps HR teams can take to integrate evidence-based thinking into their mental health and wellbeing strategies?
Yeah, that's a really, really good question. So first, as I mentioned at the beginning, I think that in terms of, it depends on the organization, but if you think about mental health at work and psychological well-being, apart from the problems in defining it and saying what it means, that's very important, saying what it means in that context for that organization, I think it's to work out who else within the organizational business are stakeholders in this. And it may be trade unions, it may be occupational health, it may be health and safety people. So who are the people that are important in that kind of mix? I think that's the first step. I think the second thing is to really collaborate, working with people, back to the point about diagnosis, to say, what are the issues we're actually dealing with here that may or may not be important. And strangely enough, part of that, and it's not often discussed in this context, is also organizational objectives. And for example, an organizational objective may be to create a context environment where people feel happy and satisfied and can flourish because they found a link between that, say, in performance, or a link between that, say, in turnover. So I think connecting also to organizational objectives is very important, partly, as I said, to get the buy-in from sort of senior management. So once you've diagnosed and thought about what the issues are, and I think a very important thing is to actually explicitly use an evidence-based practice, process, or framework. So again, one of the challenges I find is a lot of people, if you say to people, are you evidence-based? Everyone goes, yeah, I'm evidence-based. And then you say, well, what do you do? And they kind of are a bit, but they're not following a particular process. So being explicit and saying, here's a process we're going to follow, this is what we mean by evidence and data, these are the sources of data, this is how we're going to evaluate the quality, to actually explicitly and collectively adopt a process. And broadly speaking, I think some teams I've seen that adopt evidence-based practice in HR, for example, quite well, they're really explicit about that's the way they work. In other words, they tell the rest of the business, this is how we operate, this is our model, this is why we're doing it. And typically people don't go, oh, that's a terrible idea. They go, okay, I get that. And they then get used to the way you're working. And it also really helps to do that, to bring in different functions and different parts of the organization. I say, who are those stakeholders in mental health at work?
Yeah, no, it's terrific advice. So, Joelle, we're on to audience Q&A. Mm-hmm. Have you worked out how to use Menti yet?
Did you just go and accept all of the questions?
Yeah.
I thought that wasn't what we were doing, but that's okay.
Yeah, that's all right.
Yeah, I see.
Yeah, okay, cool. Yeah,
All right.
You can ask the first question.
Look, this is not a good supervisor-supervisee relationship, is it? I'm very concerned about that.
Joelle and I did a webinar recently, actually, for a partner of ours, and there was feedback form that went out afterwards. And what was the feedback again, Joelle? They didn't like how you spoke to me. They thought it was quite aggressive.
Oh, I thought it was the other way around.
Off-putting. Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
No, joking.
Joelle doesn't have to speak. She just got this look, Rob.
Yeah.
So,
It's the RBF.
yeah. Hey, there's heaps of questions.
Yeah. Right. Organisations don't have an endless amount of financial and non-financial resources to expand on practices. What evidence-based practices have you seen to be most effective in minimising psych risk?
Okay, so number one, there's no such thing as evidence-based practices. This is a really common misnomer, because let's take all the practices in the world. You can't say, here's the evidence-based ones and here's the ones that aren't. There's evidence for every practice. Even the ones that have good quality evidence behind them doesn't mean, back to the whole point about context, are going to be effective in your situation. So generally, whether it's in psychosocial safety, whether it's in HR, whatever field it's in, policing, medicine, agriculture, social work, I think we shouldn't be searching for evidence-based practices. We should be trying to follow an evidence-based practice process. Now, I'm not sure if that sort of makes total sense, but what it means is the danger with identifying practice, say, oh, look, here's 5 practices evidence-based, let's do those. That's a mistake. But I suppose in general, particularly with psychosocial health and safety, I think obviously, and it ties, as you said, very closely to the evidence-based practice approach, is you've got to do a good diagnosis first, which includes defining what you mean by stuff. That's very relevant to psychosocial health and safety, but it's also relevant to lots of areas of practice. So I would say don't search for the practices, search for your process to make that more effective.
Yeah, I think this is something that we do struggle with the clients that we talk to as well, and especially if we're looking at it from a safety frame. You know, we know that if you've got someone working at heights, these are the controls that you need to put in place, and they're going to work all the time for a working at heights situation. And that's not the same when we're talking about psychosocial hazards or sources of harm. We need to understand, well, what is it that's causing the distress, but then why, and what about that organisation is actually facilitating what's happening there. And that's going to lead to a solution that's fit for purpose for that situation. It's not necessarily, it is not the same as just having a list of things that we know are going to work.
Yeah, exactly, yeah.
Great. I think a lot of people, actually this has been upvoted 38 times, want a silver bullet here.
38?
Yeah.
Wow, you're thinking the same thing.
Yeah, they are. They are all thinking the same thing.
Yeah.
So if you had to boil it down to a single thing, what is the number one evidence-based practice organisation should be considering in terms of psych health and safety, and how do they get started on this?
Okay, I'm going to answer the same question the same way. Yeah. The number one evidence-based practice is to use an evidence-based practice process. Does that make sense? Yeah, so again, rather than looking for sort of practices, and again, if you think about risk assessment or that kind of model, and being really clear that it's not the same as physical hazards and physical risks, but there are some parallels, there's some ways it breaks down, it's just that same process. What do we mean by well-being mental health? How can we assess or measure it? What do we think is going on? Is it important for individuals or the organisation? And if it is, what can we second stage, what can we do about it using evidence and data?
Yeah.
So I think I mean, I'm happy that 38 of you asked the question in a way, but also it's a very common it is a very common question I get asked, that people say, okay, I'm working in this field, give me the one thing that really, really works. And it's kind of annoying in a way, but the right answer to most questions is, it depends. Thank you. 38 of you knew that. So why did you ask that question? But the right answer is, it depends, absolutely. And it sounds like you're trying to avoid answering it, but you're not, because then you have to work out what it depends on. Because in psychosocial health and safety, as in lots of areas, there isn't a simple answer. There are many different kinds of answers and intervention solutions, which may or may not work, or work to some extent. So it's really important we don't sort of hone in on what works, because it does really depend on the context quite a lot, I think.
Yeah. So, for health and safety, I guess plan, do, check, act is a process that they could follow.
Yeah, exactly.
All right. Can you share an example of where a HR and safety team have been able to break down silos and effectively collaborate on psych health and safety?
No. I can make one up. Shall I make one up?
We've actually got 2 case studies tomorrow that cover.
Oh, good. Well, I don't need to make it up.
Yeah.
Come to the case studies tomorrow. Thank you. Yeah.
And then you'll be able to answer that question differently next time
yes,
it comes up.
Okay. How should HR think about metric selection to evaluate wellbeing performance and the relationship between the two to understand if their interventions work?
Great. That's a really good question. The others were good as well in their own way.
Well, 30 other people agree with you.
That's a very good question.
Yeah.
Okay, so in terms of like best practice or good practice, the exception to that is if you say we want to have a measure of this thing, whatever it is, performance or whatever, I think it is the case that you can compare different measures and say in terms of things like reliability and validity, that some may perform slightly better than others. It doesn't mean it's the best, we have to use that one, but there is a way of sort of ascertaining which is better. And I think, again, going back to the 240 measures of well-being issue, I think one of the key things is that often HR and sometimes health and safety, less so I think, is people really avoid defining things. So I'm sure everyone's come across, people talk about well-being, and you mean kind of clinical health conditions, you mean people being in a bad mood, someone else means anxiety, someone else means burnout. These are all different things. And I think starting off with definitions is sort of incredibly important if you're trying to measure something. And then once those definitions are fairly clear, just going through the normal process of saying, is this measure valid? Is it reliable? Does it have content validity, predictive validity? All those kinds of things you might want from a measure. But again, I'll still say it has to be kind of context relevant, the same with performance measures. And the challenge, I think, at the moment, well, it's been around for a while, in terms of measuring performance, is we often tend to think about performance in terms of a widget factory. So we imagine that people are doing stuff you can see and measure, and they produce 50 of these a day, and you can actually see them doing it. In knowledge work, where a lot more people engaged in now, it's really hard to see that performance. So a particular challenge is defining what we mean by performance in that kind of work and adjusting our measures accordingly. So again, it comes back to definition in the context, what do these things mean, and what is most likely to measure them. So again, and typically, you can get a lot of data about measures, and it's really worth looking at that before you choose one. And some people are in favour of this, some people aren't. I think sometimes you may need to design, not for everything, but some very contextual measures, particularly around things like performance, and they can be quite important.
Good advice.
All right.
All right.
All right. Can you provide a real case example of evidence-based practice being applied to psychological or psychosocial safety? What were the learnings, struggles, and outcomes?
I'm going to have to come to those sessions tomorrow. The reason I'm reluctant is, as you can imagine, often people say, can you think of an example where people have done this, where there's a case? And in my experience, for some reason, people don't always want to share the work they've done. And I could think of some examples of, say, in HR where people have done it. But in terms of health and safety, I've got a lot of information about what people do. How successful it is, I'm not sure.
Give us the HR example.
An HR example, okay. So this is just a sort of microcosmic example, I suppose, but it was around DEI. And it was a public sector organisation, and the senior management team felt there were many, many issues around sort of DEI and what was going on around that. This HR team contracted with the senior management team to say, what is it you think you want to know? What do you think the problem is, and how does it relate to what the business is trying to do? They negotiated and contracted using the evidence-based model, and then the HR team went away with the questions the senior management team had and tried to answer them. They checked in and said, what is the evidence and data you think you need to help you understand this problem? And they sort of, it's an iterative process. They went and gathered it and then presented it back to the team, said, okay, this is the data and evidence you asked for, scientific evidence, stakeholders, organizational data, professional expertise. This is what we think of the answers to the questions. What do you think? And that was a really good example of where they contracted with the senior management team to get buy-in, to take an evidence-based practice approach to a very complicated issue like EDI, and came out at the end of it with a good, in a sense, diagnosis of what those EDI issues were. And then they went on to do the similar process, think about what can we do about it. But it was a good example, I think, of taking an evidence-based practice approach because, again, they didn't keep it a secret. They were very explicit in terms of that's the way they actually operated. So my guess would be for a health and safety team trying to do psychosocial risk assessment, for example, my guess would be taking that similar explicit contracting approach is also likely to be more effective.
Yeah, no, I think that's a useful sort of high-level process that can be applied to lots of problems.
Okay, next question. If I had to guess, I reckon Andrew Barrett asked this question because it starts, I'm curious. What's your psych, health and safety hot take, or what's the thing that's keeping you up at night?
Jet lag.
You've been here for a couple of weeks.
I have, that's true. It's not jet lag, it's probably something else now.
Yeah.
It's probably the ravages of time. Okay, I suppose there's two sort of opposite concerns. One is organizations not spending the time doing the diagnosis and not really understanding the issues they've got or not got. And I guess the other part of that is organizations doing, in terms of, it's not exactly a nightmare, maybe it's a daymare, maybe it's mild anxiety, but is organizations doing lots and lots of stuff I don't get it. So a little while ago, I went to a kind of practitioner conference, and it was all around well-being at work, and different leaders who had a responsibility for well-being were talking about the things they were doing in their organizations. They were quite, important, whatever, big organizations. And there's a couple of interesting things about it. The first thing is that every practitioner talked about what all the great stuff their organization was doing. They were all doing exactly the same list of 10 things. Suspicious. The second thing is none of them spoke about what the issues were around wellbeing in the organization, and none of them talked about evaluation. So in fact, the more I think about it, it's creating stronger levels of anxiety. Back to that question, possibly from Andrew. But, and there is, so I think there's that dual thing of not really understanding what the issue is and then doing lots of stuff that doesn't really, it's pretty unclear. Back to Fruit Basket, welcome back. A bit unclear why they're actually doing it. And I think that to me is really worrying because obviously I'm sure we all agree here that potentially psychosocial health and safety is really important. And what you get is a kind of trivializing of it by just not understanding the issue and just doing lots and lots of stuff. So you get these kind of opposite sort of extremes. So yeah, I think they're probably my main concerns.
Yeah, there is that, again, people love rolling out stuff, as you said.
They do love rolling out
activity.
Stuff, yeah.
I remember speaking to a chief health officer at an oil and gas company, and he said, we've got 100+ safeguards for mental health.
Right.
We've got no idea if any of them are working.
100+. Imagine they were getting to kind of 85 and thought, can we just find 15 more to hit that 100? What a target, yeah.
Now, I assume they're just doing heaps of stuff, and they're like, yeah, that might help mental health. We'll just add it as a safeguard.
Yeah.
All right, I work in a very large organisation.
Good for you.
I don't, somebody does.
Good for somebody.
What are some tips you might have to make psychosocial practice meaningful and not just a one-size-fits-all approach?
Yeah, and that's a really good question, and it really comes back to one of the challenges for us working in this space, is that well-being is quite a complicated thing, I think, and there are so many individual differences. So back to that one-size-fits-all, I think is a good example. So, as you may or may not know, studies that have looked at, some studies that have looked at things like increasing autonomy at work, employees can react very different to that. So for some employees, it really enhances their well-being. Other employees has no effect. Other employees, it's actually detrimental. So that's a really good indication that it's problematic to do one size fits all. On the other hand, from a legal perspective, you can't say we're going to create a kind of well-being policy for each individual worker depending on what day of the week it is. You know, you can't do that either. You can't personalize it to that extent. So I think there's a bit of a mealy-mouthed way of answering it, but I think there's a balance to be struck between saying you want to take account of individual differences in that sense and preferences, but on the other hand, you need to have a policy that is general enough that you can say applies sort of to most people. And you need to find a balance between those things. I think another way is just trying to be really clear about the different kinds of issues you're dealing with. So for example, if you are dealing with people who have chronic mental health conditions, that seems to be a very particular sort of thing. If you're saying, well, we're more interested in trying to help people in the organisation become more psychologically healthy, that's a completely different thing again. Or we're interested in general, reducing the levels of, say, anxiety in this organisation, that's another thing again. So the more specific you can be about what the problems are you're trying to deal with, I think the more you can get into not that one size fits all and focus on specific things.
Right, I reckon we've got time for 2, maybe 3 more questions before we go into our final couple of questions we ask at the end of every podcast episode. So with so much evidence-based guidance, how can an organisation coherently implement it in a way that the management and workforce can understand and apply? Did you get that?
I did, but is there a lot of evidence-based guidance? Or is there a lot of guidance?
I think there'd be a lot of guidance out there that would purport to have an evidence base behind it.
Yeah. So I think, again, the same applies to the work I was doing years ago, the health and safety executive in the UK. I think there's a sort of compliance issue, and there's a what do you want to do as an organisation issue. Sometimes they overlap, sometimes they don't. So I would sort of, obviously, if you're required to do certain things, I would start off saying, these are just things we need to do. Are they evidence-based? Has the regulator got it right? Does that matter? Because you just have to do it anyway. So I think about the things you need to do and follow those regulations and that guidance as much as you need to within the law. And I think that's really important. On the other hand, you also need to think about what else in terms of these issues that are related to that compliance do we want to do as an organisation. So you might actually need a kind of twin track approach to dealing with it. And I think as long as you've got the kind of compliance stuff reasonably well covered, it gives you the kind of a bit of freedom and latitude to think about what are the other things you want to do around psychosocial health and safety that might go beyond the guidance or be different from the guidance. But I think you have to start with that first to make sure you've got that right enough and then move on to the other stuff.
Yeah, we do see some people like to be creative, right? And I don't know if it's because they want to justify their position in their company and put a lot of effort into something. But I've seen some very good policies and procedures that just take the code of practice and just go bang, bang, bang.
Yeah, why not?
Yeah.
Absolutely.
It's good guidance. The regulator will like it.
Exactly. I think health and safety is one area where we probably don't want a huge amount of creativity.
Yeah.
In that sense, yeah.
Do you have any advice or best practice regarding dealing with weaponisation and misuse of psychosocial hazards, i.e. claiming psychosocial issues when being investigated or performance managed?
Oh, controversial. I love it.
Pete loves this question. It's Pete.
Okay, so is it possible that someone who is being scrutinised for their performance may suggest that they are being mistreated at work, for example? Which is contributing to that performance when they're not really? Yes and no. Yes, of course, that's always a possibility that people might not be telling the truth or lying. On the other hand, the fact people are raising that as an issue means it's something you actually need to take seriously. Now, how you take it seriously, how you examine it, how you investigate it is a different sort of set of questions. And I think, yeah, and I guess it applies to physical health as well. People might claim to have physical conditions that they don't kind of really have as a way of getting out of stuff. And yeah, people do that. Everyone does it probably sometimes. Phones in work sick when they're not sick, putting on a croaky voice. Oh, I can't come in today. I'm really ill. Have anyone ever done that? Just me then, okay. Or school, did you ever do school? Yeah, maybe. Depends on your parents, I guess. So that, of course, that can happen, but I think we shouldn't assume that's happening, and we need, to take it seriously. I think that's the point. And also, they're often tied up, of course. It may be that someone who feels their performance is being scrutinized, it actually might be making them more anxious, and the way the manager may be scrutinizing it may be construed as harassment or bullying or something else. So I think, yeah, we have to take it seriously.
Yeah, and I think in particular, if we're seeing a change in someone's performance where they were a good performer and that's dropped off, we would actually want to explore reasons rather than just jumping straight to discipline.
Exactly, and that's another example where it may be, obviously I don't know, but it seems to me likely that if you see a really big drop in someone's performance, it could equally, if not more, be something to do something outside work. But again, an employer, has some responsibility for finding out about that, as you say.
Okay, last audience question.
Yep.
HR people are often at higher risk of psychosocial risk. So you can think about some of the hazards they are exposed to, I guess, they have to do, or they're exposed to vicarious trauma if employees share things with them. It might be, aggression from employees when they're enacting company policy. There's lots, workload obviously is a huge issue for most HR people I speak to as well. So have you got any thoughts on how to help with this?
Yeah, so this is maybe what provoked the question, is there's quite a lot of discussion within the HR profession around this thing of like, we're supposed to be like partly the custodians of well-being at work, but look at what we're doing to ourselves. So this is not exactly a joke. I think one way of dealing with this is to stop rolling things out so much. Seriously, because if you're just like constantly doing stuff all the time, this is obviously one thing that will tend to lead to those kinds of negative moods, negative feelings and so on, particularly when you can't, in the back of your mind, it's maybe not adding value. And more than anything, the employees see it's not adding value. So one thing, when you're working very, very hard, one thing that makes it even harder is if the people you kind of think you're trying to help with it don't actually see any value in what you're doing. So in terms of things like burnout, for example, that's a classic sort of depersonalization, not seeing adding value kind of issue. So seriously, I think doing fewer things, but doing them well and making them relevant to the business is one way of actually dealing with that. And I think, again, it depends, but some people argue that some people are attracted into HR partly because they have that desire to help other people. And as we know, that generally speaking, the helping professions, there are issues there around people getting, as you say, over-involved, being exposed to stuff that makes them uncomfortable and so on. So I think trying to find the ways of sort of managing that and drawing boundaries around stuff is also very important. But I think crucially, it's about looking at all the things you could do in HR function and saying, we cannot do all these things. We absolutely need to prioritize. How do you prioritize? Through kind of taking an evidence-based approach and doing what's important for the business and doing stuff that's more likely to work. I think if you just did that, that will go quite a long way to reducing some of that workload and some of those demands.
Yep. Now we take stock regularly of all the busy work that we're doing and going, is that really needed? Can we remove something? I like the idea of wellbeing interventions that are actually, subtraction rather than adding new programs.
Yep.
All right, so the last two questions, Rob, we ask at the end of all of the podcasts, and I haven't had enough time to go back to I never have enough time to go back to other podcasts and go, well, what did they answer last time? What are your hopes for the future of workplace mental health?
Okay.
So specific to that, I know you've practiced in a range of different areas.
Sure. Yeah. So this might sound a bit odd, but I think one of my hopes around workplace mental health is that to remember that in general and in principle, work is good for people's mental health. And this is something often forgotten when we're thinking about psychosocial hazards. We just think work is bad and it's our job to make it less bad by putting in controls. Yes, that's kind of important. But broadly speaking, work is a very significant part of people's lives. The idea of good work, good quality work and so on. So I think in terms of thinking about mental health, I think almost focusing as well, and I don't mean positive psychology, which I've got a bit of a thing about, which you can ask me later about if you like. I'll be very negative about it. But is to think about, look, work should be a place where people can learn stuff, can do things, can get meaning from it, can build relationships, can feel valued, can feel they're making a difference to something. These are old fundamental ideas about the role of work. So I think my hopes would be, while we're thinking about psychosocial hazards and controlling it, also think about, well, work is supposed to be and can be and is for many people, but not always that kind of, it should be like that, ideally. And you can't kind of force it, and some of the things you need to do to make that happen are in a way quite simple. So that would be one of my main hopes, I think, yeah.
Yeah, beautiful.
All right, final question for you
Okay.
today. What are your parting words of advice for professionals who want to work in the field of psychosocial safety?
My parting words of advice would be about defining the words you're using. I know it sounds a really strange thing to say, but so often I find with practitioners in many fields, including health and safety and HR and organisational psychology, they're using words and they don't really know what they mean by them. And that's okay if you're having a general chat with your mates, that's fine. But if you're trying to practically do something and make a difference, to be as precise as you can be about what you mean by those words, what you don't mean by those words, how you're going to assess or measure or look at those things in the world, I think is absolutely crucial. And I think, for example, the case of well-being, sometimes when I work with health and safety or well-being practitioners, I often sort of get them to say, what do you mean by well-being? And it's quite a revelation for some of them. They've been working in it for years and years and years, and they have not, as it were, sat down and thought and discussed what they mean by this word they use the whole time and may even be in their job title. And I think that's a really important starting point to think about how you want to practice as a professional and, of course, to do evidence-based practice.
Yep, good advice.
Well, Rob, thanks again so much for flying all the way across
Very welcome.
the
Thank
world.
you for bringing me over. It's been
all the way from the UK. Yeah, it's been great. Could everyone give Rob a big round of applause?
Thank you very much. Thank you for the questions.
You've been listening to the Psych Health and Safety Podcast. To stay up to date with the latest on psychological injury prevention, follow Flourish DX on LinkedIn and subscribe to the Psych Health and Safety Podcast at www.psychealthandsafety.com.